Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name's James Harding, and it is my great pleasure to have the chance to talk to EDMUND DE WAAL, and I hope that over the course of this next hour, we'll all feel as though we get a chance to talk to EDMUND DE WAAL. If you want to know why it's me who gets to have a go at, and Edmund does, the first questions, I guess it goes back to the origins of the Hare with the Amber Eyes. Edmund and I studied Japanese together, more eating than the language, I would say. And we competed fiercely to be the bottom of the class, and I think we left our other classmates quite a distance between us. But when Edmund had written the manuscript of the Hare with the Amber Eyes, he sent it to me. I was at the Times then and a journalist, and he said, "Would you have a look at it for me?" And I remember taking it home one weekend and reading it, and I sent him an email after the weekend that said, "Edmund, I think this is the most beautiful and moving and thoughtful and important book, but no one's ever going to publish it. And no one's ever going to publish it because, frankly, who cares? Who wants to know about your family and a bunch of little tchotchkes? You know, that's the truth." And over the years, this story has got more embarrassing as we've moved from the hundreds of thousands to the millions to the 22 languages. I don't know how many languages it is now. And I've decided that I'm going to rewrite this particular piece of history. In fact, the conversation we're going to have is about writing and rewriting history. And I now think, given my misplaced sense of self-esteem, that this actually tells something about the talismanic qualities I have as an editor. So if anyone here has a really useless manuscript, send it my way and who knows what'll happen. Edmund, let's start. We couldn't be in a more perfect...
That could be the end. I mean, it's just so perfect.
We couldn't be in a more perfect setting, really, to talk about...
It's like home.
It's like... We're back in the front room.
Exactly.
But to talk about family and the ownership of things and how that relates to a sense of ourselves and a relationship with our history, you know, the serious point about Hare with the Amber Eyes is, of course, it was a book about belongings and a sense of belonging, and presumably it changed your view of those things. It changed your view of your family and your relationship with things that you owned.
Yeah, I mean, it was 7 years in the writing and the travelling. It's 7 years since it was published and since we sat together at Jewish Book Week, and you made that joke.
And I usually stick with the same ones for longer.
It's very good. So in terms of how it's changed me and where I've gone with the story and what it's done to who I am and to those around me, how that's changed lives of the people around me, my family, as well. It's an extremely complicated bit of territory. So at this point, I'm going to pretend that there's absolutely no one there at all. So, and the reality is, of course, that you can't write about something that important thinking of an audience. That's the first thing. So you write it entirely for yourself. And we'll talk about other people who've tried to do this, who've done it brilliantly as well in a minute. But you have to, when you're writing about identity, it can't be for a public. You know, it can't be for broadcast. It's absolutely that sort of that archaeology of where you come from, how complicated that bit of territory is, and writing it is hugely exploratory. And actually, if you're aware of the ramifications at all for the rest of the family, then you're doomed. You've already edited out all the serious stuff, and you're left with just a sort of carapace of a kind of a narrative.
And does that mean that in the process of exploring it, you put their sensitivities aside, or in the process of writing it, or both?
Both. So the reality is, if you've got a story, a family story, and it becomes your story, you have to own it totally. And in that sense, I really tried to put aside, and I successfully put aside, any sense of my responsibility to my siblings, my parents, or indeed, in fact, Iggy and Hare, the two key people in it, until I'd finished the book, until I'd actually finished the book. And at that moment, there was this extraordinary handing over, both to Hare, who was still alive, and also to my father, both with the question, can I publish this? That was the question.
And what was it? Just explain. So, what were their sensitivities, particularly the two of them?
So, for Hare, it was, I think, extraordinarily difficult, in the sense that it was seeing his life, this wonderful long relationship with Iggy, written about so publicly, but he really wanted it to be published. He absolutely was completely clear that he absolutely wanted it to be published. It was an extraordinary bit of communication with him.
But there'd never been, just for example, take Hare for a second, there'd never been a suggestion, I mean, he'd had this relationship with Iggy for half a century. It wasn't as though people were unclear that they were a gay couple and that they had a gay relationship in Tokyo. No. So he just didn't want it exposed?
It's just that there'd never been a book like that in Japanese society. There's never been a book published which is about a Western man and a Japanese man living together. There is no history of that at all. It doesn't exist.
And your father?
It's a big deal.
Yeah, can you imagine?
So,
and your father?
But he was extraordinarily, wonderfully. I went back to talk to him about. I had 3 days with him in Tokyo with the manuscript, saying, "This is it. What's wrong? Is there? Here it is." And he was absolutely. He gave me his blessing completely, extraordinarily. And my father, I sent it to, and I said, this is it. And I didn't hear anything over the weekend. I thought, shit. Because I'd said, if you don't want this published, it won't be published. I sort of gave him that agency. And then he rang up on the Monday to say, that I'd got one thing terribly wrong. And I was thinking, what is it? And he said that in the Tyrol, where they were living in exile in 1939, there was a band in the village, a village band, and he played the trumpet in this village band, and I said it's the worst, terrible band, and he said no, it's the most beautiful music, it was the most wonderful music ever, and he made me change that. That was the one thing he made me change. The rest was all right. He actually he loved it.
And and for those people who read the book, obviously one
Sorry,
of the things...
we've delved right straight. This is a total mistake, actually. This is complete
so
muck up.
So there's
a book.
So why don't tell people what the story's about? Now you're back in. When Edmund said we were just going to speak as though it was just the two of us? Actually, that bit was. So apologies.
A long time ago, I went to Japan when I was 17 to become a potter. And when I was in Japan, I met my great-uncle Iggy, this wonderful, elderly, Jewish, Viennese gentleman who lived in an apartment in Tokyo with his partner Hare in the neighbouring apartment, double doors, 2 kitchens, beautiful setup. And in his drawing room, there was a vitrine with 264 of these little tiny Japanese sculptures, these netsukes. And he said, there's a story here. And then when we went back, when we were both there trying to learn Japanese, I have to say, James, of course, aced Japanese. That was a total lie. He was an absolute... I spent that year, when not having sushi with James, talking to Iggy, and that became closer and closer as a relationship and a friend. And then when Iggy died, I went back and I buried him with Hare, and I went to this beautiful, beautiful Buddhist temple And Giro did all the Buddhist rites, and I said the Kaddish for him. And when we went back to the apartment, I discovered that Iggy had given me all the netsuke in his will. So I inherit these netsuke collection, and eventually I bring back to England, and we have it in our family house in Camberwell. And I realised that this collection is a story, and it's a complicated, problematic story that I need to understand, and that takes me on the journey of where this collection had been, and that unravels a whole history of this particular collection, which had come from this dynastic Jewish family that had begun in Odessa and then gone to Paris and gone to Vienna and become this great banking dynasty and collected extraordinary things. And that this collection was the only tangible, bodily part of that whole 250 years of this diasporic, migratory, interesting, engaging family that had tried to belong in multiple places and tried to make sense of different cities and different ways of living and different ways of collecting, and intersected with huge and complicated bits of history right from the 18th century through the Dreyfus affair right up to the Anschluss in Vienna. And that was the one thing that was left, and it had been given to me. So I had to do something with it, and I spent 7 bloody years trying to work it out and wrote a book. So that's the story.
And I remember, because we went, I remember going once up to Iggy's apartment.
Yes, he loved you.
And
who's that very well brought up young man? He can come again.
And I misread. I remember leaving there with you, having seen the netsuke in that vitrine, in that glass cabinet. And do you want to just describe to people what netsuke are, how they actually feel?
So they are it's small sculpture. It's sculpture for the hand. They're all extraordinary 17th, 18th, 19th century tiny sculptures which had a use. I mean, they were toggles for kimonos, for hang off your. But they are animals, mythological things, and they're about sex and death and all kinds of. There are people and animals and all kinds of small narratives, but they are intensely tactile. They are for handling. And some of them are beautiful and some of them absolute kitsch. You know? So they span a whole series of...
Because I remember leaving Iggy's apartment and having seen them for the first time and having heard just one element, one fragment of the story, which was about how they were returned to your family after the Anschluss, after the Nazis had moved into Austria and Vienna. And do you want to tell people a little bit about that story? Because it was quite a reunion, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you want me to make me cry on stage, you know, at Cliveden, but it's... Yes. Thank you. Complicated stuff. I mean, complicated stuff in that... At the Anschluss, in this extraordinary house on the Ringstrasse where my grandmother's family lived, full of art, was appropriated, looted, grandfather beaten up, all that, and the house was systematically looted by the Nazis. And my grandmother goes back in 1945, end of 1945, to sort of a ruined Vienna. She escaped with my father and my uncle and her father. My great-grandmother had committed suicide. So she goes back after the war to this sort of ruined city and goes back to the Palais Fossey and goes in there, and there's absolutely nothing there. There's the Americans there, and there's the Americans say lieutenant from Tennessee, I think, says to my grandmother Elizabeth, there's nothing here, but there's someone who might know something about the story of what happened. And it's her mother's maid, Anna, who'd been part of her life since childhood. And it emerged that during the Anschluss, in this period of unimaginable violence and horror, and this sort of this extraordinary inversion of the most civilized metropolitan, cosmopolitan society in Europe into this vacuum of horror, that she had, while the Nazis were looting everything, she had taken all this collection of netsuke, which had been in my great-grandmother's dressing room, and hidden them. And that when my grandmother goes back, there's Anna, and she gives my grandmother back this collection. It's an extraordinary kind of moment of sort of connection and of histories coming together, and and then, it's extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. And then my grandmother brings them back to England, and then Iggy, this dispossessed man who'd fought in the American army, doesn't know where to do or what to do, sees them in my grandmother's house and says, I know what I'll do, I'll take them home. So he decides to go to Japan. He goes to Japan and makes a life.
And I suppose that the reason why we took that, and I hope it was worth taking the detour to go back through some of the elements of the book, is it takes us back to the point about your father. So when I got to know you, Edmund, here you'd grown up in the shadow of not just a church, but a great church. Your father had served in the Church of England. And yet when someone like me, I'm Jewish, my family's original name was Hershevitz, when I read the story of your family, it feels like a story that's so familiar and important to me, about an odyssey across Europe, flight from persecution, the establishment of successful families that then get disbanded. For your father, having been such a significant figure in the Church of England, then to be, if you like, the standard bearer for a story of the Jewish diaspora, how did he feel about that?
Well, in some ways, that's the heart of the whole thing, is trying to understand, how my dad, who was the Dean of Canterbury, for God's sake, why he spoke with a very strong accent and looked like an effing rabbi. So it's just a very long-winded way
of how the transfer window works.
Exactly.
But he was,
and so he's Jewish. His mother was Jewish. He was Jewish, and he converted. And of course, what emerges, and of course, that was really the heart of the identity stuff about the book, is that he arrives in May 1939. Speaking German, is put into a prep school in Tunbridge Wells. Imagine how good that is. So what does he do? He becomes more English than the English, and he converts, and he becomes, and it's a proper conversion. He believes, this is his stuff, but it's evensong, evensong matters to him, and then in there he is, with my mother, who is, comes from an Anglican family. Her father was an Anglican priest, etc. So we have this, embedded English upbringing, with a man who speaks with a very, very strong Austrian accent, and so but it's fascinating, because for him, of course, the book made total sense for him as well, because he had been holding all that stuff together, and he's 90 now, and he works in the local refugee centre. So his identity as a refugee is become more and more, open for him as an experience.
And can I ask you, I mean, when I became a reporter, one of my first job as a journalist, I actually went to go and see my grandmother, Elsie, and I went and I said, look, Granny, you know, I know that when we arrived here before the war, we changed our name. We were Hershowitz and we changed our name to Harding. And she had wanted to be a journalist, but one of the first things that Hitler had done was to bar Jews from the press. And so I thought, well, maybe I should actually take the name back. I should go back and be James Hershowitz and start a career. And before I'd ever had my first byline, that I should do that. And Granny, who had a voice that was quite a bit deeper than mine, said, no, darling, there's no need to wash your dirty linen in public.
Yes, yeah.
So way she thought about it. And I was thinking about that as you talked, because I think I don't want to do that, but I do quite want to do yours.
Yeah. I can walk off the stage by
any moment.
I'm not being paid to do this.
Edmund's siblings, right? Because the thing that is, if we want to get into the real delicacy here, is that every single one of us has a family history and a family story that we tell that is slightly different to the story that our sisters or brothers or cousins tell. But when one person writes the story, they own it in a way that is that is fast and cemented.
Yeah, absolutely. So if one sibling writes the story, this is universal, and there's a great club of people who have written family stories, including your wonderful cousin Thomas, who's extraordinary books. As soon as the book comes out, all the other siblings go, well, you know, I could have done that. I actually chose not to write that book. You know, I've been meaning to write that book for a long time. I just was busy.
Yes.
And they're right. They were busy, and they didn't do it. So, you know, so you have to look your siblings in the eye at the moment, because actually there is that strange moment when you have told a story which is now your story, and they are not invested in that. It's complicated. It's complicated stuff.
So what do you do about it? So because what you're saying there sounds, I think, easier than it possibly is, in that you're saying it's your story, but they may feel as though actually it's their story, but it's been coloured in by you without their consent.
Yeah. But I got the fucking netsuke, and they didn't. So I mean, I got given a particular story. So the story that I tell is not only the story of the family, but it's a story about touch.
Right.
So it's an autobiography about how touch affects you and how much history exists in the hand, and how much memory is present within buildings, within objects. Within collections. So that's my take on it. Now, I have three extraordinary brothers, you know, a barrister, a human, and two human rights, extraordinary human rights writers, you know, and their take on it would be profoundly different from it. And so, of course, there's a jarring moment. Of course there's that jarring moment. Mm-hmm. But my God, that's because it matters. That's because it matters a lot. But you have to own your own agency in being able to tell a story. So it's not the family story. It's a part of the family story.
Did they, if you like, agree with the version, not of the belonging, not of the netscape, but of the identity of the history?
Yes.
So that's very important.
It's hugely important. And what's interesting at this moment, 7 years on, is that we've done two things. One is we've given our family archive to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, which is a huge deal. So it's all gone back to Vienna. And also my bit of the family, Sue and me and the children, the netsuke collection is going on very long-term loan to the Jewish Museum in Vienna this November.
Is it?
Yes, it's going back to Vienna.
Oh my
so
goodness.
We are passing it back so that it can be present in Vienna and tell a story in Vienna. So that's quite a huge deal. So that's a kind of inversion of the expectation that, you know, you want everything back.
Oh my God! So hold on. So where...
Don't tell me you're surprised, James.
No,
you never get surprised by anything.
No, I am. I'm really confused by that. Because that raised a question about where things belong.
Yeah. So they belong to us, but actually we have got the choice about what to do with that. And so actually by giving them back as a loan, they can work really hard.
Oh, I see. So
really,
it's not.
really
so it's
hard.
not that they. It's not that because of course, in his own way, Iggy took them to Japan with a sense that that's where they belonged.
Yeah.
And obviously, then they arrived with you because, as an artist and a potter, presumably he thought that there was a physical, tactile thing that they thought they belonged with you. And you're making a choice, if I get this right, in saying we can actually do something with those.
Yes. Yes.
And what is it that you want to do?
Well, they're going to do an exhibition there, and the exhibition will go off around the world. So they're going to actually tell that particular story and make it happen for different audiences. And actually, I was talking to the, director of the Jewish Museum this week, and so they're going to be kids are going to be able to handle them in the museum, and there's a whole other life that they can have. And in 10 years' time, they'll come back. They'll come back to us. And our children will be grown up and they can have them in their families. And that's fine. It's just for 10 years, this idea that you can have the power to say, actually, we've got these things. They're extraordinary. And they can do something really, really interesting.
So can you tell us a bit about ownership, right, and thinking about ownership? So we're all increasingly encouraged to discard things. We're increasingly encouraged to share things. We're increasingly encouraged not to care too much about things. And yet, of course, the book is about, and your work is about, the creation and the ownership of things.
Yes.
Please tell us more.
I mean, for me, being a human being is about powerfully about the implicit storytelling in objects. That as soon as you have an object and you put it down in the world in a particular way, you have a relationship with material, you have a relationship with history, you have a relationship with the person who's sitting next to you. And how you think about that spatially, immediately, but how you think about it across time is hugely important. That's why I use porcelain, for goodness sake. Porcelain is the most storied, beautiful metaphor for human endeavour and history and the Silk Road and complexity that you can possibly do. So making things out of that particular material, making things, trying to bring things into the world and then put them down in interesting ways in conjunction with each other, in vitrines or in spaces or in buildings or in museums, houses, wherever, is a conversation between the world and history and people and on our hands, which seems to me really, really profound. It seems to be about how you are as a human being. And so yes to objects. Throwing stuff away is fantastic. Love it. Brilliant. But having things is also really important. And it's what you do with them. It's how you throw them away. It's pretty interesting as well. Or break them, in my case, in the studio. but all those absolutely god-awful books by Americans about how you can change your life by throwing everything away seem to me missing a hugely serious point about where we come from, and how we choose to people our environment by objects, and people our lives by things and move them around. So objects are always in transit. They're always in transit. Objects are diasporic. It's so cool. That's why those metaphors matter. It's biblical.
So tell me, because I I want to ask a bit about porcelain and about the White Road, because that book felt, in a way in which Hare with the Amber Eyes felt familiar to me, literally like about my family. That the White Road and a journey about porcelain and an understanding about porcelain felt not familiar but personal, in that I felt, my God, now I'm getting a chance to understand what it's like to work with materials every day and to care and think about them, which I don't. I don't have that life. But you started off by saying writing a book you do for yourself. How did that work out for yourself?
I mean, it's the same. I mean, the reality is that for me, writing is a kind of making anyway.
Huh.
You know, so I mean, my sense of how language works and how the weight of words and the structure of sentences and the sight of a paragraph on a page and the feeling of cadence in a chapter is profoundly bodily. It's making something. So, you know, the first book, The Hare with the Amber Eyes, is a series of walks, and that has a shape to it. And then The White Road is a series of white spaces, different kinds of it's another series of walks, but for me it's a made object, like an installation. It really is. It's an attempt to try and explore why I'm so obsessed with white. I use a beautiful epigraph from Moby Dick. What is this thing of whiteness? And of course I don't understand by the end of the book it any better than I did at the beginning, which is hugely frustrating for anyone who's bothered to try and read the book. But actually for me, thinking aloud in that form makes sense. And it's closer to poetry at intervals than I've ever been before.
Can we do just a bit about that? I mean, it's such a thing. You know, many of us will have seen your work, your pottery in the Vienna, in exhibitions, in collections, and yet actually what none of us understand is actually the experience of making a pot. And I just wanted you, in a very practical way, to tell us, like, what's your day? How does it work? What do you actually do?
You get in a taxi to Cliveden. Every day is different, but the miraculous days when I have in the studio, when I go in early and there's so you have to imagine an old factory in South London, huge, so twice the size of this room, white.
We got that.
Yeah. And you come in through the front door and you can either go left, which goes up to my library and a beautiful space to write in, or you can go straight on and there's a big room where I put my installations together, and then you keep going, and at the other end of the studio are the kilns and the glazing stuff and the materials, and I go up to another room, which is my kind of private studio, and there's only a bench, hugely uncomfortable bench, which I've been using for 35 years. Unbelievably uncomfortable. And my wheel. And then a table here with balls of clay, of whatever size I want. Just white, beautiful, plastic, porcelain from Limoges. And then empty boards on the other side, and a bucket of water, and a sponge, and a wire, and a machine that plays music. So you put on the music, and you pick up the first ball of beautiful clay, and you throw it down into the middle of the wheel, and the wheel spins, and then it's all right. The world is all right. But it's all right because actually I'm in this thing that I've done for almost 50 years, which is, I was 5 when I started this ridiculous thing. I'm 54 now. That's a lot of time spent throwing pots. So it goes into the middle of and you center it, which is this extraordinary thing. It's not a metaphor, it's a thing. It's centering. It's bringing something which is wayward and strange and contingent into the middle of something, and then water, and you begin to make a vessel, and you make a vessel. And of course, what a vessel is, it's not an outside, it's an inside. It's a breath. You make a volume, which is so cool, extraordinary. You've made a volume where there was no volume before. And you take your wire, and you take this vessel off, and you put it to one side, and then you do it again. And that's the other great thing. You do it again, and you do it again and again. And so what it is that beautiful, extraordinary iteration of an idea. You come back to it, you go away, you come back to it, you go away. So you have Glenn Gould doing the Goldberg variations or something, and you've got that extraordinary sense of really of breathing in and breathing out. And then someone comes in and says, can I talk to you about this email because there's this person who... But actually that's the thing, that's the heart of it, is that's the private bit. Well, it was private until you asked me the question.
And then that process is because physically that must be actually a very demanding thing. You can do that for an hour, for 2 hours. What can you do that?
Yes, hours and hours.
Oh, in the course of a day, you'll do that.
Yes.
So in the course of a day, how many? Well,
it depends. It depends. That depends on what I'm trying to make. So, so I'm not so randomly making them. For some,
you're not randomly making.
No,
them. No, I'm glad to hear that.
Weirdly, weirdly enough. So I've got an idea. So I've got an idea of a space, or I've got an exhibition coming up, which is in a particular museum, and there's a space going down the stairs where the light comes in on the left. So I know that I need 25 vessels to make, and they're going to be white. Well, one of the whites, there are 240 whites that we use in the studio, so a particular select, whatever. So that's several hours of making those. And
240 whites you use in the studio, how many whites are available?
Well, that's a start. I mean, I'm hoping to keep going for another few decades.
No, I'm saying, you say we have 240 whites that you use.
Yes, we have 240 whites. So in my kiln room, we have thousands of glaze tests. So
you select those 240
so we
whites.
Every time we do a firing, we put more glaze tests in. So I'm also using black glazes on my porcelain. So big news here. big news in my world.
I landed a scoop here. This is big. But just explain for us this second. So 240 whites are the whites that you selected out of the different whites that you've tried.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So can we just go?
Yeah.
I just want to go. I want to go to the email question. Right. That's quite more boring but prosaic. Right. We're in Clifton, and it's hard not to think about rich people.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So how does that, what you described is extremely, is beautiful and romantic and individual, and yet of course the reality of art is that patronage and patrons and buyers intersect with that process. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How, as an artist, you relate to patrons, to buyers?
So, I mean, my practice that's my practice. I try and make the most beautiful, interrogative things I can in the world and find places to put them. So that involves either having exhibitions in museums and spaces where people can walk in and see them, and that's one part of my practice. And the other thing is selling them. And they're not cheap, as you say, as you sensitively pointed out. And I'm okay with that.
No, the reason I want to...
Because the things that I do, I don't do very many of them, and they are the things I need to do, and they can be huge. They might have scale. But for instance, there is this strange intersection where you have to be driven by you have to do the next project that you need to do. You don't just do stuff for rich people.
No, actually, funny, that wasn't the drive of the question. Actually, it was about something slightly different. We're all fascinated by the relationship between, for example, media owners and then what happens in our media, or the people who fund politics, and then what happens to politics and policy as a result. And we've also got a romanticised idea of great moments in art where, you know, the Renaissance happens, suddenly you get this flowering of Italian art, and at the heart of it, it's about patronage. And yet we don't have a notion in the world of art about the relationship between sort of patronage or patrons and artists, and whether or not those patrons shape or change the way the artist behaves.
So, I mean, it's complicated, you know, and I mean it's complicated because I can look back at my own family, and I can look back at my family and think they were good patrons, you know. They bought the Degas and the Renoirs. They were quite cool. Then I look back at my great-grandparents and I thought they were terrible. They bought the most, patronised the most appalling 19th century academic paintings possible. So, you know, patronage can go in all kinds of ways, and it's really complicated. But the real heart of that is that you can, is that at the moment, the most interesting patrons aren't the sort of oligarchs buying art. Next week is Frieze. You know, next week is Frieze, and London will be full of private jets descending to buy huge, extraordinary, expensive things. You know, and that's fine. That's part of the international contemporary art world. But the most interesting things are always happening elsewhere, and the patrons there are interesting museums and odd curators and musicians and writers who are making things happen in really fascinating ways. And so it's that interplay of trying to sell things that you really want to do, which keeps your studio going and has real authenticity and integrity, and then do completely idiotic, off-piste, interesting, engaging things.
Yeah. And presumably because so much of your work is around installations, where you put things has a big impact on what you make.
Yes. So, you know, the last few years, I mean, I worked with the Walter Benjamin archive in Berlin. Walter Benjamin, hero, writer on art, flaneur. Sorry, that was me being emotional, trying to tap my heart. Man of extraordinary everything. So I worked with his archive, and I made a memorial for him in Berlin. You know, huge, extraordinary exhibition which took a year to do. You know, completely uncommercial, wonderful thing using his archive. You know, next year in Vienna, not Vienna. Where am I talking about? Venice, in the Biennale. I'm working in the ghetto, in one of the synagogues, making a piece about the Psalms. You know, because the Psalms matter. And half a mile away in this beautiful 17th century building.
Hold on. Just explain. So how does a potter make a piece about Psalms?
Well,
I know it sounds obvious to you, but it's...
You're really asking me this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the Psalms are both an individual voice and a collective voice. They move all the time between exhortatory, one person asking something of God, and many people asking, the collective. And they're songs, it's music, they're to be sung. And they are personal and they are tribal simultaneously. And so, you know, when you're in a space which is like some of the extraordinary synagogues in the ghetto, these 5 amazing synagogues, you know, how wouldn't you want to make a series of very beautiful, extraordinary vitrines where you have both where you have objects which have singular and multiple cadences between them. You have different voices happening within the vessels, where you want to have broken things and complete things together, where you have gold and white happening
No, I'm loving this. You're misreading my face. Kate sometimes says to me, "What are you doing looking at me with that face?" And I say, "This is my face." So that's all that is. Yeah.
So in the ghetto, there'll be that, and then this is the cool thing. That's pretty cool, actually. So come and see that. It's just opens just before Passover in the ghetto, and then in this amazing 17th century a space called the Ateneo, the Athenaeum. I'm making a library. So you'll go into this extraordinary space, Tintoretto's blah, blah, blah on the walls, marble floor, and inside this beautiful space, there'll be this white, freestanding structure with walls of porcelain, gold leafed, and then porcelain slip over the whole thing. And I'll have written the names of every single lost library since Alexandria around it. And you can go into this library, 2,000 books in translation. It's everything in someone else's language. Because Venice was the great place of Jewish publishing. It was the center of the world. Everything was published there. And it's this lost history of not of melancholic, the ghetto is this sort of melancholic lost place, but as a place of incredible vigor. So this is going to be a library for the whole of the Biennale, where you can just go and read, and there'll be events and debates and stuff about translation and migration and poetry. And it's an installation. And no one asked me to do that, for goodness sake, because no one would, because it's totally stupid. But it will be utterly beautiful and important
so
for me.
Can I ask you, I want to make sure we've got about a quarter now to make sure we hear from other people, stories, questions, thoughts that you've got. But on that final point, Edmund, what do you think about, I'm sure you do think about, the role of the artist in society beyond the art, particularly around politics and the nature of the artist as an activist, if you like?
So there are different kinds. You can be you can be any kind of provocateur as an artist, and we know and love several of them in our contemporary life. But actually, the most provocative thing you can do as an artist is support education. It is by far the most radical thing you could do. So I do two things. It's great to do Beyond the Barricades, all that stuff. But actually, the real heart, the real responsibility, I'm a trustee of two things. One is the V&A, extraordinary engine of change in all kinds of things. And the other is a thing called the Saturday Club, which gives free art lessons across the country on Saturdays to 25,000 kids. And that's for me a profoundly political act, which is to say, to people who actually have art has been stripped out of schools. I mean, it's a terrible landscape for arts provision in schools. I was 5 when I was allowed to start making things, and that's why I'm here in this place. And actually, so that's my bit of politics.
Yeah.
That's my barricade.
All right, let's.
There may be no questions.
There may be no, but this gentleman has helped me out. We didn't even. And so, would you just say your name?
My name is Michael Brahams, and are you worried this extraordinary collection of netsuke is going back to Vienna, where it left because of anti-Semitism, and now there is a considerable amount of anti-Semitism there? Are you still going to send it there?
Yes, I am, because I think the power of storytelling is so extraordinary that you have to do what you can to make and reveal hidden stories and opaque stories present. So, in my case, that book about the family had a considerable impact in Austria. It was and still does. I mean, it's had an effect in the politics of restitution, and it's had an effect in Austria in terms of personalizing and humanizing the story of the Anschluss. I'm very proud of that. And there is this extraordinary museum that tries to tell stories about Jewish life in Vienna. So I'm incredibly proud that they're going back at this incredibly difficult time. And just if one other thing, it's not over, the storytelling. So for instance, I was telling you that I was talking to the director of the Jewish Museum last week. Extraordinary enough, she said that they'd been in the National Library of Austria last week, the researchers, because they're doing an exhibition, and they discovered my grandfather's library in the National Library, the lost library, inscribed books, So it's ongoing thing. So, you engage fully.
Other thoughts or questions? Sir, there's a gentleman there. Do you just catch my eye, wave? Say.
Hi, Simon Lerner. I was just wondering, going back to Hare the extent to which you encountered the debate, which was a big debate going on in the Jewish world at the time, between assimilationism and Zionism, whether you encountered that at all.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because, of course, in my own family's case, that the amount of assimilation is extraordinary. Wherever they go, they become more Parisian, or more Viennese, or more Tunbridge Wells, than thou. But what I discovered post hoc is the level, though they were doing all that, they were also, and I find this very extraordinary and perplexing, is though they were living in the Rue Monceau or in the Ringstrasse, they kept their charities going in Odessa. So they were supporting orphanages, Jewish hospitals and Jewish schools in Odessa right the way through to the 1920s, to the last gasp, before those pogroms in the early Soviet period. So even though they were assimilating, they kept alive that whole bit of Jewish charity there. In terms of Zionism, they didn't touch it. None of them touched that at all. It's very interesting because they knew Herzl. And I think didn't like him. So an odd situation.
Other thoughts or questions? Madam, there. There's a lady in the middle with very cool glasses.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My name's Sarah King.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Would you say?
My name's Sarah King.
Yes.
As a boy from Tunbridge Wells, with a Christian upbringing, but with a very heavy Jewish heritage, where does that place you now?
In what way? No, I'm going to answer you. How long have you got? It's interesting. I find myself drawn very intensely back to my extraordinary childhood in Canterbury and Lincoln cathedrals, and those places were so beautiful and so special, and the liturgies of those particular cathedrals, the Christian liturgies, that kind of rhythm of the offices has profoundly affected me, and I think it's kind of there in my work in a funny kind of way, sort of contemplative attitude bit of my work. And of course, that whole ridiculous journey of trying to write the book and then post hoc, the almost terrifying identification with me as a kind of lost Jewish boy. When are you coming back, as the Americans kept saying on my book tour. Can't we take you to temple now? How are you bringing up your children? Has been quite difficult. Because, of course, I'm partially Jewish. And, of course, I identify very strongly with the people I love in my family who are Jewish or were Jewish. So it's an interesting journey in that sense. And I'm choosing to work in a synagogue in Venice, and that's a choice, and make this library for this community in Venice. And that's an interesting ongoing thing for me.
And it's a really interesting thing. We've had a conversation where we've talked about your father and evensong and Jews in the diaspora and the Psalms and actually I suddenly realised we haven't at any point touched on God. As if in your experience or your perception of these things, religions are mostly cultural rather than a spiritual. Is that the way you see it, or is that just an assumption?
That's an assumption.
Sorry about that. So what's your view?
This is the third time I've been on stage with you, James, in my life. Do you know, I have such fierce children. I have terrifying children, and they take me apart. They say, do you really believe that? How can you possibly say that? How can you, and they take me apart bit by bit by bit. And they are all, in their ways, more agnostic than now. So we've done well. But yes, it is. There is something there which is very, very important for me, and I think I suppose quite a bit of the work I make comes out of that. To be honest, and that's why I'm drawn to the poetry of Paul Celan, the great Romanian poet who wrote in German, the great poet of the 20th century. Because Celan, hates God. He struggles with God all his life. God is absent. And yet the poems keep going back and back and back to the absence and necessity for trying to find God. So, and the poems are heartbreaking. And so for me, Celan is the great poet I go back to for trying to understand why it matters.
There's a lady at the back.
I need a drink.
My name is Lena McGugan. Just a question back to the material sort of things of this world. I read the book and loved it, of course, and I'm more interested in the collection, actually. Is it still in the same way you inherited it? Have you been tempted to expand it? Have you invested into netsukes? Have you created any netsukes? What's happening with the collection as an entity?
So that's a very pertinent question. Because at the moment that we send the collection back to Vienna, we've made a decision that a part of the collection is going to be sold. And it's going to be sold for refugee charities. So the collection, we've looked at the collection, we decided that it actually is a coherent collection for 3 children. A beautiful collection for 3 children. But a part of the collection, mostly, I have to say, the netsukes that Iggy bought after the war, when he was back in Tokyo, we've decided will be sold and everything will go to refugees. Because there is that thing about things being in transit, things really do change. They really do change. And if you look at the world now, how can you not want to do something about that? So the collection, the vast collection stays together, and part of it will be sold.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you get to the end of the hour, there's always a slightly toe-curling moment where I say thank you to Edmund. I hope that you won't mind if this is more toe-curling than usual. Taking Edmund out of his studio is a battle. it is a rarity that he'll come and do this. And it's an act of kindness on your part, Edmund, and yours, Sue, too, to come and be here this afternoon. It is a really great privilege to get to hear you, and I'm massively grateful to you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed.